rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting drunk. In a black and white picture, there's a lot of gray bunk. Man, you're hitting their books and hitting their streets. Won't be hard to find. Tell new questions, asking me to hide. Asking me to hide.
Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to Lies, More Lies, and Damned Media Lies. The title of our podcast is a bastardization of Mark Twain's Lies, Damned Lies, and Statistics. We'll look at the sins of omission and commission of today's print, television, and digital media, in the line not only of Twain, but also A.J. Liebling, Alexander Colburn, and Beavis and Butthead. I'm Dennis Bro, journalist, novelist, media critic.
And I'm Jaleesa Ducro, an independent journalist.
And we're Bro.
And Ducro.
Going at the news. Okay, we'll lead off with this piece, which is called Truth. Always a casualty, and this is in this war a fatality. The first casualty of war is the truth was spoken in one of its iterations by a senator in 1918, appalled at a new level of censorship in the U.S. after the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. In this new war to end all wars, the corporate media censorship of truth is even heavier and done in broad daylight, so that truth is not just a casualty, but a fatality. The lies are more transparent in what Max Blumenthal has termed Operation Epstein Fury, as opposed to Trump's G.I. Joe fourth grade level Sergeant Rock cartoonish Operation Epic Fury. In this war, where the excuses are a rerun of the Iraq War, weapons of mass destruction, in both cases false, it's truly second time as farce, though for both Iraq and Iran, the result is tragedy. Woodrow Wilson dragged the U.S. into the First World War as a war to end all wars. And one of the rationales in this one is that finally, the Iran threat will be ended. However, there's a new meaning to war to end all wars because as the U.S.-Russia nuclear treaties are allowed to expire by the U.S., and as Israel could unleash its atomic bombs at any point, we come closer in any of these U.S.-provoked conflagrations, be it Ukraine, Taiwan, or Iran, to war to end all wars, meaning the destruction of humankind. Before we get to the media coverage, let's look at three reasons behind the war. The U.S. in its war is not necessarily fighting Iran, but rather is positioning itself for the coming war with China, having first cut off China's access to Venezuelan oil with the capturing of Maduro, and now desiring in its attack on Iran to itself control access to the Strait of Hormuz, so it can control Middle East oil access to China. While also in Europe, NATO is boarding Russian tankers to attempt to cut off another source of Chinese oil. In that sense, the senseless attack on Iran is what U.S. policy in the Middle East has always been about, at least since 1953, when the CIA, along with British MI6, overthrew Mossadegh. And that is, it's about oil. Ultimately, this war is about control of the world's energy supplies, the most effective way of maintaining fading U.S. hegemony. To say nothing of the profits accruing to U.S. oil companies from control of this supply, which also began in 1953, when the U.S., after effecting the coup, then opened Iran's oil not just to British Petroleum, which prior to the nationalization had simply stolen the oil, reputedly not paying a penny for it, but also now to U.S. companies. America's reward for spearheading the coup. You will hear little of this in the U.S. media, inflamed with its holy war against backward Muslim Iran, openly stated on Fox News, but on the more liberal and supposedly progressive media, argued under the banner of democracy. The effect, though, is the same, supporting the destruction of the Iranian Revolution, whose primary crime is active resistance to U.S. imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism. There are, of course, similar, pettier reasons for the war. On the Israeli side, not only to keep Netanyahu and his far-right Zionist coalition in power, but also to continue to shield him from an almost certain Israeli court condemnation for corruption, a sword of Damocles that hangs over his head. On the U.S. side, Epstein Fury is the diversion that sidelines the Epstein investigation and replaces global headlines about a corrupt Israeli U.S. pedophile regime, a system that encompasses not only Trump and past U.S. administrations, but also the heads of the financial and tech worlds. Epstein fury having two meanings. That is, the fury by the American and Israeli pedophile elite that they were being called into question, which then leads to their fury unleashed against a country that never threatened the U.S. and that plunges the world into economic chaos. The targeting of at least 165 schoolgirls in Minab is a further escalation of the crimes against young women by the Epstein regime. First rape and now murder. The Muslim girls' school recommences on Saturdays, the date a bomb struck, and in its targeting recalls the Nazi deliberate bombing of the marketplace in Guernica on everyone's shopping day, the horror of which Picasso expressed so well. That's what the bombing means to the Iranian families. To the U.S. warmongers, Saturday was also the day to start this war of choice because the bond markets were closed and thus couldn't react until Monday, by which time they figured the war would be over. Okay, a huge beneficiary from the war already is Microsoft's Bill Gates, who, after a quick apology for his supposed implication in Epstein's world of underage trafficking with the war's onset, secured a Pentagon contract with OpenAI, Microsoft's partner, after another AI company, Anthropic, refused the contract because it claimed the Pentagon wanted to use AI to spy on American citizens. Spying on American citizens is apparently just fine with Bill Gates, though Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, claims that there are now safeguards in place, a claim that will probably make Edward Snowden turn over in his media grave, since he, like all truth tellers, is silenced in the corporate media. While you were watching the already biased coverage of the war, Larry Ellison, he the largest personal donor to Israel's IDF, which has led the Gaza genocide, and his son David took over Warner Brothers, giving them access to CNN and completing what I have called a far-right Zionist media coup. They now control or have major interests in CBS, CNN, TikTok, which had introduced the genocide to American youth and which has now expunged those videos, as well as Comedy Central. Soon, even the WB's Batman will be fighting Arab terrorists, and Superman will soon stand for truth, justice, and the Zionist way. Let's look at the corporate media coverage. The propaganda is at such a level that when the Iranian foreign minister appeared on the major networks explaining that Iran was striking back in self-defense, one corporate media quizzling then asked why they would attack foreign countries. And he had to explain that Iran was attacking U.S. bases in those countries from where missiles and drones were launched against them. And that was their lawful right to protect themselves. The idea in the corporate media being that anything short of abject surrender is Iranian aggression. On CNN, the supposed neutral, straight-ahead network, retired Army Brigadier General Steve Anderson, while discussing perhaps erroneously how Iran's missile launching ability is being degraded, called the country's inhabitants Uranians, as if they were from another planet, which for him, since they're not in the American-Israeli orbit, they are. Corporate media, in subservience to their petroleum industry backers, also explain the polls in an exaggerated way, showing again on CNN that Republican support is 87 to 13% in favor, and Dems oppose it, thus normalizing the dissent and not pointing out that the majority of American voters are independents, and that before the war, 80% of U.S. voters opposed it. That is confining the war to the two-party system, which the largest percentage of U.S. voters are not part of. In navigating corporate media, one of the first similarities between the supposed vast difference between the right-wing Fox News, the center CNN, and the left MSNBC is that it's difficult to find any moment when all three are not on a commercial break. That is, the news is fitted around, made to conform to the selling imperative, which also includes plugging their own network, even as the ratings fall on all three. Desert Storm featured the emergence of CNN. The Iran war was about the dominance of Fox, while Epstein Fury may be about the emergence of alternative news and podcasts over the most dominant ratings-wise network, YouTube, which in daytime dwarfs all three. The news networks even follow the trend pioneered in sports of a series of ads, followed by a few seconds preview of what is to come, followed by more ads. On MSNBC's Morning Joe, a female anchor looking like Hillary Clinton explained that the war, which Israel and the U.S. started, was, quote, to stabilize Iran to where it was no threat, leaving off that one of the reasons for the timing of the war was that Iran had made major concessions to the U.S. around its nuclear program, and the war was started the day those concessions were to be announced in order to circumvent the negotiation. The Hillary Clinton lookalike then wondered who was going to take over the leadership when the war ended, echoing the liberal hope for democracy in Iran. That is, democracy at the barrel of a gun. And really what the U.S. is hoping for, and the media is actually cheering on, a la Hillary Clinton in Libya, is a failed and divided oil state that the U.S. can plunder. CNN then dragged out Brett McGurk, the former National Security Council advisor, partly responsible for George W. Bush's illegal war in Iraq and the never-ending war in Afghanistan, who explained that the campaign was to stop Iran, quote, from spreading terrorism all over its borders, which, as a country, more accurately describes Israel, at war at various times with Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Sudan, Iran, Iraq, and Yemen. On Fox, following a press conference in which the aptly named Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, practically declared the war over because the U.S., he claimed, now controlled Iran airspace, a press conference designed to make an upcoming vote by Congress on Trump's circumvention of the War Powers Act obsolete since the Pentagon declared the war was over, the network responded with its expert, Jack Keane, the former vice chief of staff who, along with Rudy Giuliani, John Bolton, and Nancy Pelosi, is a hawkish supporter of the cultish Iranian overthrow group MEK, then echoed the sentiment that Iran could no longer strike back, but this was interrupted by cutting to Tel Aviv, where a correspondent wearing a flak jacket and helmet could barely be heard over the sound of sirens signaling incoming Iranian missiles. A blonde Pam Bondi-esque anchor then termed the Israeli terrorist attack on Lebanese doctors and nurses through exploding hospital pagers a triumph. Finally, the network cut to an ad extolling the powers of Botox to manage chronic migraines, which with no mention of the fact that it was the threat of global war, economic meltdown, and the corporate media's benign, unwavering, and undifferentiated downplaying of those threats, which may be inducing migraines. It's worth mentioning that the best, most varied, and accurate coverage of this war is by Al Jazeera, available all day online, which after the Hegseth presser mentioned that the attacks on Iran were, as in Iraq, also attacks on its hospitals and heritage sites, running a crawl underneath the anchor that mentioned a UN report focused on illegal Israeli acts, and finally ending its evaluation on George W. Bush's, as the network termed it, quote, declaration of victory that didn't succeed, thus calling Hague-Smith, the rationale for Hague-Smith's presser completely in question. And that's our opening salvo.
Look at something that is consistent throughout this entire segment, which is that the United States acts as the antagonist or the aggressor and then continues to frame these countries in turn as these unprecedented strikes that just began in a vacuum. And it's really, it really reflects the lack of accountability, but also I think the discoordination and unorganization inside of the administration. They can't even really settle their messaging straight across the board. You know what I mean?
It's pathetic.
Exactly. You have Trump making extremely callous statements like people are going to die and we're going to bomb Iran into hell, which he actually said today that they're being beat into hell. And then you have them holding press briefings with members of the Senate and Congress that are coming out and saying, they're not really even giving us a reason justifiable for this war. Like, we didn't hear anything. And these are members of our Congress, of our government. And they're not providing us that. And it's because they have no clear objectives for this war. So anyways, I think that that's very interesting. And,
I just want to say, last time you mentioned the phrase strategic incompetence. And that's what you're describing. This is strategic incompetence. In other words, it used to be that you just said, well, I don't recall. Now you act so dumb that people just expect you to be dumb, and that's your excuse.
Yes, there's this brazen hubris and willful incompetence that this administration possesses that we didn't see in Biden era. Biden era was very good at being like, I'll get back to you. Let me ask a question about that with someone. And then we never got the answers. This administration is like, I ran bad. What about it? Like, it's quite scary when you look at the messaging on this. Likewise, I want to touch on the kind of brazen narcissism when we talk about messaging coming from Pete Hegseth, who appears to be like the mouthpiece of this entire war, right? He kind of represents like this genre of young men that he wants to galvanize into joining the military and like hoo-ah and guns and like creatine and we work out and we're going to go guns a-blazing. Like, this is their Top Gun. And it's really scary that we have memified, you see the administration on the official White House page dropping like, a like deep meme edits of war movies to like rock music of them basically committing war crimes in another country, a sovereign country at that. And this is being cheered on as something that's normal. It's becoming something we can giggle at and laugh at, And so it's really scary kind of coming from Pete Hegseth, who's supposed to kind of lead us. If you think about it, right, generally speaking, I mean, he's a really poor leader, but you should be leading diplomatically, even if you're lying. But, I guess we can appreciate that they're kind of bold facing this and showing us who they are brazenly.
Yeah, I think too, just even, the naming of this is so clumsy.
Yes.
Like it really is. I think, as I said, it's kind of a cartoonish comic book G.I. Joe name.
Yes.
Epic Fury. Where's that come from? I mean, I hate to say I'm nostalgic, but I am a bit nostalgic for names like Desert Storm, which at least had a sort of poetic ring to it while the bombs were dropping and they were killing people. This is just clumsy and stupid.
Literally and you know what? It's like this entire thing was manufactured for like video game fanatics, people that sit in their basement and play video games and they think this is real life, but war is not a video game.
Yeah.
And that's the problem here. And so, like it's becoming increasingly evident, but to your point about Operation Epic Fury, we used to name operations as something that had no correlation to what we were actually doing. And now it's Operation Fury, which I know was just kind of like an ego thing. This administration is driven entirely off of ego. It's evident in their messaging, but they also have no clear objectives, which represents their disorganization. I mean, I think you remember the media leading up to the illegal bombing, of Iran alongside Israel. I think you remember that it was like conflicting reports that a lot of the administration couldn't decide if they wanted to move forward with this because it was deeply unpopular in the United States. It's a deeply unpopular issue. I think even in the MAGA base, a lot of them have defected since Trump has kind of come out with, this decision to bomb Iran. So anyways, the point that I'm making here is that, there weren't any clear objectives or any like united consensus among the population to really do this anyways. So it's just kind of, in blatant words, a shit show.
Yeah. And I think Hegseth, that's right. I think Hegseth too tries to project this sort of confidence, that it's all over, we control the airspace, which comes across really as sort of lack of confidence. He's a little boy playing with toys.
Exactly. And when we talk logistics about like, what do you really have, so something that I was going to talk is this also, which we spoke about last time, is this kind of strategic omission. What are they not telling us, right? They are just kind of posting these large, very like grandiose, perceived wins. Right. But that's also a strategy, is to overexert or overinflate your accomplishments as a form of psychological warfare, right? To convince the masses that you are winning this and that we can keep going because we are winning. And, it's kind of what they did during the, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is like, oh no, we're beating them. We're beating them and we're beating them so good. We have to keep going. And in fact, you're actually bleeding us of billions. American soldiers are dying when they don't need to be dying. And it's because of you and you're lying. So this is what I think we're continuing to see.
As Norman Finkelstein said about Afghanistan, after 20 years, after billions of dollars, after untold numbers of human lives, the United States replaced the Taliban with the Taliban.
And that's all they're going to do. And the mistake also about Iran is they've galvanized the population. This is what I mean, is like, it's just a mess in and of itself. Why would you think that you could bomb a country into submission? It's never worked. Now, they're pitching. Yep. Never. Like, do we even have any recollection of history? It's never worked. And even if you were to put ground troops in there, Iran is not Iraq and it's not Afghanistan whatsoever.
Huge country.
Exactly. Mountainous terrain that we have it's a conservative force. It is a completely different ballgame we're not equipped with. The United States haven't fought a traditional war like we did for First World War, Second World War, whatever, anything like that. Even during, the early 2000s, post 9/11, we haven't fought a war like that in forever. We have proxies now. We have AI and drones, and we have Israel to kind of, further our agenda inside of the Middle East.
The ultimate proxy.
Exactly, the ultimate proxy, like our gold standard proxy. But back to Hegseth, what he's not telling us. I remember some reporters, I'll try to get the clip for you. Some reporters were asking him questions about some targets that they targeted or what they had planned for the future as far as, strategic targeting and stuff. And he says, why would I tell you that? Why would we let our enemies know? And I'm like, that is a really interesting thing because he's kind of framing it as this like strategic security mechanism that it's like, I'm going to withhold transparency, but it's for your safety so that we can keep you safe. So just trust me, source. Trust me, bro.
Yeah. Yeah. As if anyone actually trusts, sort of, what is it? Ex-alcoholic Fox newscaster to lead us.
Yeah.
This is the best. This is the best we have,
Oh, seriously, this administration it's crazy.
It's true. Okay, do you want to go just to your section now, to Narrative Watch, and talk a bit about the overall narrative? That's
definitely. In this in this segment of Narrative Watch, we're going to be addressing some headlines, some articles that I've read over inside of the amidst the war with Iran, and it kind of goes in line with exactly what we were just talking about. So I want to start off with the form of this bias in media and reporting, right? I think that you can still advocate for, your own homeland, right? But at the end of the day, we have to address what is international law and the very real reality that we caused this war, which is something that the United States administration and corporate media is trying to kind of dance around. And you can see it in the language, which is these unprecedented strikes, right? That's the biggest one that we're seeing, that these strikes came in a vacuum. And so you kind of have this whitewashing language.
Yeah, and also the lies, that when he got called on, Hegseth actually said that Iran started the war, which everyone knows to be a blatant lie.
Exactly. And so, because of the brazenness of they're confidently lying. And you know what, good or bad, you can't beat somebody that's consistently bad or consistently good. And they're being consistently bad. They're extremely consistently bad in their messaging. And I think, it's kind of how
that's what Goebbels said. If you keep telling the lie enough times, people will believe it.
Exactly. But I also think that this is a tactic to exhaust the people. How many times can we repeat ourselves that it's like, it doesn't make sense? What do you mean? You bombed Iran first. Iran is retaliating. So then we can go into, the framing around, we are omitting again the facts. So we're changing reality now, which is a tactic in the media. We are changing reality in real time about how this started. That way we can skip over that gray area and we can get right to the fact that Iran is bombing GCC countries that harbor United States bases, which Iran did notify, if you do bomb us, we will be targeting American assets. Yep. So it's not like
GCC.
Exactly. It's not like GCC permanently, like we hate the Qataris, we hate Bahrainis, no, these are American assets and American investments inside of these countries.
And also American bases from which missiles are being launched at Iran.
Exactly.
Self-defense.
Exactly. And these interceptors that they have blowing out of there, like in Jordan and basically all of the GCC. So that's something that they do is like, again, like we said, the strategic omission, but not even that. It's a corporate media tactic to basically rewrite history, rewrite the reality. Yes. And the thing is they're so high up in the empire and this threshold, right, that it's almost impossible for your average person, your average citizen, to kind of try and combat this. Another thing is what they did, and we had to pay very close attention to this, that I want to point out. Just a couple weeks before we launched this war on Iran, okay, there were massive reports of this civil unrest, right, in which reports came out that Mossad and CIA agents or Mossad agents were being, arrested and detained because they were caught causing civil strife inside of the country, right? So we know that there was like an internal mechanism from Israel where they infiltrated the country to kind of cause this unrest, which was confirmed in a report that I'll also link for you. Okay. And because of this, there were mass protests, to which happened in a vacuum. There were numbers that were starting to be floated. Well, they killed 30,000 people from Iranian citizens. They killed 40,000 people. It seemed like overnight Iran killed 30,000 people, right? So now you have corporate media putting out these facts that they can't verify. There's no footage. Mind you, we have footage of everything else. There's no footage. There's no testimonies. There's not anything. Not that there weren't collateral, because people did die in these protests, okay? But we manufactured this consent to basically intervene in Iran with this story that has absolutely no solid evidence that 30,000 Iranians were murdered at all.
Yes.
And so we create these pretexts silently. It's very silent, because we start drip dropping these little stories into American media. And it's like, isn't that bad? Isn't that bad? Which in turn kind of creates this, this genre of support, or this base of support to continue. And the corporate media just amplifies those select few voices.
Yes.
So it's really interesting how,
I want to bring up the thing about Jon Stewart, actually, because I've stopped listening to Jon Stewart, and then I thought at the beginning of this, when he was attacking this as Trump's war, oh, Jon Stewart is back. But alas, no. Jon Stewart did not understand that Khomeini sacrificed himself. That is, he did not go underground in a bunker, whereas Netanyahu fled to Germany.
yes.
He did not go underground in a bunker. He chose to die. He knew they were targeting him. They target exactly, they killed Soleimani. They've killed numbers of Iranian scientists. They know where they are. They knew he knew they knew where he was. And he decided, this 86-year-old actual revolutionary, we have early pictures of him with Thomas Sankara in Africa. He decided to sacrifice himself, for the good of the country. And Jon Stewart misunderstood this. He said, Khomeini's a dope. He should have been underground. How could he be so stupid? This is just part of the misunderstanding, of one culture really badly misunderstanding another.
And you know what? I've said this before. This is a foreign and extremely misunderstood concept in Western and American minds, and that is the concept of martyrdom.
Yeah.
The concept of martyrdom is deeply misunderstood, and it's kind of framed around this narrative of, I'm going to be honest, and this is going to sound very harsh. Americans perceive martyrdom as basically kamikaze suicide bombers.
Oh yeah, that's the way they talk about it. Right.
Is that a fair kind of?
That's the way they think of it, not what it is. Yeah.
Not what it is. Absolutely. This is kind of how the Western mind perceives this. And it's all due to extremely heavy propaganda by our own administrations, every administration, by the way, not just the Trump administration. But also this rhetoric that we've created so that we can incite in the Middle East, right? And make enemies out of Muslims. But that's not at all what it is. These leaders are fearless, right? Whereas they are willing to make this sacrifice for the betterment of their own country, allow new leadership to come in and say, if I die, which is what Sinwar, as well as what's in Lebanon, he was over Hezbollah, Said Hassan. Said Hassan, as well as Soleimani, and as well as the Ayatollah, is you can kill me, but the idea and the mission and the people are still there. You cannot kill idea. You can also not kill off a shared purpose. That is something that instead galvanizes a group, and the United States definitely, I think, underestimated that. And you can see that exactly. And so you can tell the United States underestimated that. It did not work in Gaza. It did not work in Lebanon. It did not work anywhere at all. And it's not going to work in Iran, who has, mind you, 4 times the presence of all of those countries, mind you, millions more people, mind you, also.
Yeah.
And the base is just,
by the way, if you think Jon Stewart is bad now, wait till you see Jon Stewart under the the dominance of Paramount and the Zionists.
Gross. I'm sure he's totally complicit. Yeah. But one more thing on the topic of Iran is that you had people, and I mean, these voices are extremely loud now and prominent. You had people that voiced their opposition to the Ayatollah, right? They said, I don't want to live under a theocratic, whatever society. I don't want to live like that. But they are not endorsing that change come through the hands of the United States. This is why we had the revolution in Iran as well. You cannot instill American, puppets in these these countries and expect these people to just swallow it, especially not the Iranians. I think that they're a different kind of person. And I'm not speaking about the diaspora. I'm speaking about the people actually living in the country. A lot of them, through the bombings, they're like, wait, you're liberating us through bombing us and killing my cousin, sister, friend, mother, aunt. Like, I think they're very aware of this. And even if they were not in support of the Ayatollah or, such leaders,
yes,
that you have galvanized the entire population of Iran to actually defy this. It's like, I don't really see too much.
How could you be more stupid or strategically incompetent?
Exactly.
Or just plain incompetent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing.
Yes. Shall we continue with Narrative Watch, or do you want me to go to Times Watch?
No, you're fine. Let's go to Times Watch.
Okay, so I'll ask you to comment on these stories. I've got 3 of them for this week's regular feature of our podcast titled Times Watch, where we review and comment on stories in the New York Times that illustrate the privileged status of those media mavens inside the Washington Imperial Beltway and the New York financial bubble. First up is a story about the sentencing in South Korea of a U.S.-backed president who attempted during the Biden administration a coup, which was turned back. Let's see. Okay, so that's our first story. Let's see. All right. The Times is in a difficult position because the country has avidly sided with the maintaining of the democracy and overwhelmingly rejected Yoon Suk-yeol's attempt to cancel the legislature because it was annoying him. He found governing in a democracy just too odious, a bit like our own president, and just decided to end the whole thing in a coup the U.S. favored. The Times, as the U.S. government as a whole, has to look like it's critical of the coup while actually hoping the democratic sentiment in the country does not do permanent damage, which might actually mean the 2 Koreas suing for peace in a war that has never formally ended and reuniting to create another Asian powerhouse to challenge the U.S. The Times does this in the story by exaggerating the support for the would-be dictator, making it seem like the country is divided on whether it wants to go back to the horribly repressive days of the former U.S.-imposed dictatorship or continue on its present path, which has led to a modicum of prosperity. This con game begins with the headline, Dueling Protests at South Korea Ex-Leader's Sentencing Highlight Political Rift. Dueling protests and political rift suggest the society is torn between democracy and dictatorship, when in fact, the far-right protesters at the sentencing, though boisterous, are in the overwhelming majority, with 77% of the country opposing the attempted coup. Not for the Times. For the Times, they're equal. The paper notes the deep political polarization of a country divided, where in this case, neither are true. Le Monde, on the other hand, noted that after the aborted coup, quote, trust in society climbed to record levels, while also noting that Yeol's followers were not only nationalist and pro-American, but also pro-Japanese, with many of them descendants of families who collaborated with the Japanese occupiers from 1910 to 1945. Not for the Times, though, which, paying obeisance to its State Department masters, represents the nation as deeply divided. So that's our first story. I don't know if you want to comment on that or not, or wait till the end.
Yeah, let's wait to the end. I have thoughts.
Okay, good. The Times runs an almost daily China-hating story, pushing not the right-wing line of active engagement of war, but rather knocking every achievement of a society that it's in its prosperity. It has lifted 800 million people out of poverty and is beginning to surpass the U.S. not only in manufacturing, but also technology, and as such serves as a non or at least less exploitive model of the development for the global South in its own struggle to alleviate poverty. The first story's headline, Stock Slide and Slow Sales, What's Happening to China's EV Market? Electric vehicles. That market has been a huge success, with Chinese pollution-fighting electric cars penetrating many markets in the West, including Britain and soon-to-be Canada, with the oil-guzzling U.S. soon to be left behind. Not for the Times. The story begins by noting that the electric vehicle maker BYD has now surpassed the West's main competitor Tesla, but the paper mourns the company's passing, noting that it has become victim of its own success, despite the fact that the company sold 2.26 million electric cars globally last year, up 28% from 2024. Nevertheless, global doom for the Times lies just around the corner. The next story is even more ludicrous. Headlined, "Where are China's AI doomers?" This piece of Western propaganda takes China and its people to task for being optimistic about AI, whereas in the West, there is widespread fear of the phenomenon, being not only a bubble that will eventually sink the economy, but also a device that may unemploy approximately 30% of the workforce, with prospects for future employment dim. In China, AI comes under the purview of central planning, with a good deal of care given to what industries AI will inhabit or encroach on. Also, development of AI is shifted to the areas of most need. For example, AI bots for senior care. And in addition, Chinese AI uses open source that anyone has access to, instead of locking the source code up behind expensive paywalls. So in Chinese society, there is naturally optimism about how AI can improve lives, with the important point being not the technology itself, but the system under which it is being developed. Not for the times, though. This optimism is instead a grim reminder of a society of duped individuals blindly following party policy just because it makes their lives better. The Times is at pains to figure out why people are more optimistic instead of critical, as in the West. The article notes that Chinese companies have been giving away money and luxury cars to download their apps. That is, instead of in the West, charging money to download the apps. And of course, the article in the end raises the old bugaboo of censorship, where the AI universe is not free and uncensored. This fear is raised even as the capitalist media and its AI makers are enlisted under the sign of the Pentagon, and as AI is used in the U.S. to increasingly monitor citizens' activity. The Times' suspicions about an AI that works for people is really its suspicion that a society that puts its own people in the forefront over corporate profit must have something wrong with it. Finally, there is a gem of a story about those in the Donetsk in Ukraine fearing the arrival of the Russians, which is this year imminent, as Ukraine's supply lines and man and woman power wear ever thinner. The story presents westernized Ukrainians, the lead photo is of a female hairdresser, in the eastern Donbass, who say they will, the western Donbass, who say they will have to give up their lifestyle and freedom if Ukraine turns over the rest of the Donbass to Russia to prevent another year's worth of slaughtering Ukrainians. The cannon fodder for NATO's unsuccessful war to weaken Russia, a war NATO wants to fight to the last Ukrainian. This despite the fact that almost 70% of the Ukrainians are in favor of ending the war. The author in this photo-heavy story talked to a total of 4 people to force the reader to draw the conclusion that peace in Ukraine would be horrific. The plethora of photos perhaps to make up for the paper's lack of finding those who took the side of these 4. Russian is the main language of approximately 75% of those in the Donbass, from where the Times conducted its survey. And NATO and the West, in the years leading up to the Russian special military operation, killed over 14,000 in the Donbass. The Ukrainian parliament, before the war began, passed a law making Ukraine the official language and forbidding Russia being used in any state functions, which in part led to the attempts at succession on the part of the predominantly Russian speakers in the Donbass. The Times, though, tells the story of 4 pro-Western dissenters who will likely have to move if there's a settlement. The Times, if they actually cared anything about Ukrainians, might better spend its time telling the stories of those shanghaied into the army, to the point where older men are afraid to leave their homes for fear of being whisked away to the front, where a whole generation has fled the country rather than be killed in NATO's war. But that leaves out the 4 Ukrainians whose grand sacrifice for peace would mean leaving an area where they are likely loathed. And that's Times Watch.
Let me start at the bottom and then move backwards. First of all, let's address the very obvious that the story reportedly only interviews 4 people, but somehow represents the views or presents the views as like representative of the entire country, or this rhetoric, which I also find very interesting. That's very intentional when it comes to media, which I'm sure you know. So also the thing is that a lot of the residents in Donbass are Russian speaking. And so these suggestions, I think, might be a little more, more mixed. It kind of ignores the idea of like this forced mobilization in Ukraine, like people are fleeing the country and like, the public support for ending the war. And so then the media, the Western media, is kind of portraying peace or like territorial compromise as like worse than a continued war. I think also that it's like framing peace or settlement as a tragedy because like a few pro-Western, residents might need to like leave the region, compromising, like security. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. I think that that's an interesting point. And then moving backwards, it's for the first part about the about South Korea. This is particularly interesting because the New York Times is definitely a part of corporate media and frames the situation as like dueling protests and a political rift, as to like paint the entire idea of what's happening there in favor of their personal interests or geopolitical goals. And then, I mean, we know where that leads. Then you like build up popular support domestically to do whatever in South Korea, whether it's like coup, regime change, things like that. Um, and like Yoon allegedly attempted an anti-democratic action, but tried canceling the legislature. And I think there is, irony.
Not allegedly. He attempted it. He did attempt it.
Yeah. So, like all of this language in this like projection, it like reflects United States like geopolitical interests, and it like portrays the situation, I think, more balanced than it actually is. What do you think?
Yes, I think it's an exaggeration to portray it as equal when 77% of the people, it's 77 against 23, That's
Absolutely.
The society's not divided. That society doesn't want to go back to the dictatorship backed by the US. Nobody wants that, really.
And this is how they kind of like soft launch this for us in the United States, but they also start kind of like infecting the minds of maybe people in Korea, like to try and change their minds or slowly alter the rhetoric of what's happening, when in reality there is no division. But it's like corporate media is so good at like soft launching division, and it's slowly. And I think you mentioned that as a tactic, I want to say on our first or second episode, where it was like this small, like even in like television, like you said, but it's like through small rhetoric like this.
That's why they get the big bucks. Yes.
Huh?
That's the big bucks.
That's why they make so much money.
Although many of the reporters sell themselves out for not the big bucks, just mediocre bucks,
Yeah, absolutely. They do it for the love of the game. They don't even need to make that much money. The story about the AI, I only have like 2 notes on that. And then I guess we can like dabble on that. That when China's EV industry, which is actually doing really well, and like you said, growing rapidly, it's framed as like a sign of like some problems rather than success.
Always.
Right. And then the Chinese citizens are like optimistic about AI, and that's portrayed as like naive, or they're being manipulated and things like that. And, really it's actually counter in the United States. The United States was actually suffering, which is why we were trying to get to the South for lithium reserves, so we could make those batteries and get ahead of the game with EV. And even Donald Trump said this actually. And so again, this comes out in media framing that we're kind of like putting the Chinese down for this, and kind of criticizing them to create this kind of negative rhetoric around their success, and to flip this to make them look bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I mean, really, since 1953, the thing they really fear is a united Korea.
Yeah,
they can't have that.
A united Africa, a united Middle East, a united Korea. We just don't want anything but a United States.
Right. What they can have is a moderately prosperous South Korea with a number of U.S. bases being policed by the U.S. to make sure that there are no moves to try to unite the North and the South into one unit, which would really make a powerhouse of Korea.
Moderately democratic, hinged to the United States for security, and completely dependent, externally, lack of thereof. That's all we want.
That's right. Yes. Okay. Well, that's Times Watch. So to conclude, I wanted to for our last segment, look at 2 horror films, what they reveal about the American character, which is becoming more debased every day. And my review is titled Get Help: What Send Help and Scream 7 Expose About the American Character. In the era of declining box office, which Paramount, now taking over Warner Brothers, claims to revive, though we know that's a lie, Paramount will go where the money is. And the money right now is in streaming. Anyway, in this era, box office receipts may be declining, but there's one staple that works revenue-wise, and that is the horror film. Minimum budget for maximum profit and an almost guaranteed audience. Two staples of that genre, Sam Raimi's Send Help and Kevin Williamson's Scream 7, recently released, unfortunately also betray sordid aspects of the same kind of penny-pinching mentality that begat them in the first place. The larger ideological disaster is Send Help, which begins promisingly as an abused female employee, aptly named Linda Little, or Amy Adams, played by Amy Adams, who no matter how hard she tries, cannot get the recognition she deserves from her male supervisor or the new youthful head of the company who, surrounded by his male buddies, is more interested in improving his putting in his office than listening to her ideas for improving the company. Now, spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about the plot. So just tune out for the next minute if you want. It's not long before, in a plane crash off Thailand, the two are isolated and her literal survivor skills come to the fore. That is learned from her watching the series Survivor. The boss is wounded and weak after the crash, but still wants to exert his male privilege over her. So she sets out to teach him some lessons. Sounds great so far, and it is. The problem occurs when we find out she may have homicidal tendencies and may have exercised them in getting rid of an abusive spouse. Those tendencies reemerge when the boss's black fiancé and a Thai fisherman sight her on the island. In order to keep her newfound power, she pushes both of them off a cliff and begins a duel to the death with her boss. She wins the duel, and in a coda is now wealthy, having sold her book and appearing as the celebrity at a golf tournament, thus completely turning the tables on her miniature golf former employer. The problem is she is now more ruthless than even her boss. But her ruthlessness, achieved by murdering a black woman and an Asian worker, is celebrated. The ending is double-voiced, that is, appealing to two audiences, one that will read it as literally a triumph, and the other, supposedly more worldly, that will read it as ironic. But the thrust of the ending is to validate ruthlessness as the only way to achieve what is called success in this society, and that may be true. A society that is this unequal requires absolute ruthlessness to get to the top. And by the way, this element of the film goes unremarked by even the most astute critics like Le Monde's Jean-François Roger. A word then about the element of irony present in both films that contributes to making the audience immune to violence. Just at the moment, American audiences are being asked to be immune to the violence that is being wreaked on the Middle East by its leaders, whose own ruthlessness knows no ends. Sam Raimi is famous for injecting two things at once into the horror film. That is both upping the level of grossness and explicitness of the violence, and at the same time, injecting humor alongside the horror. This is the formula for the Evil Dead series, but also as a formula, as we see it playing out in real life, for deadening its audience to the effects of violence, so that in the West, violence itself, and as in this film, violence against the peoples of the global South, is welcomed as titillating and can be written off as humorous or ironic. The second film, Scream 7, begins with what is sometimes called a structuring absence. That is, Marissa Barrera and Jenny Ortega, two Latin actresses who had been used to reignite a faltering franchise, were not to be found. Instead, the series returns to its origins with Neve Campbell reappearing with a daughter who, if the franchise endures, which is doubtful, will be the next iteration of what is called and referred to in this film as the final girl. That is, she who survives and defeats the male violence. The reason for this change is that Marissa Barrera has made some openly pro-Palestinian statements, calling Gaza a concentration camp, but also that she has been actively campaigning against police violence because her brother was, she says, murdered by the Woodland, California police. Her partner, Jenny Ortega, in solidarity, then also dropped out of the franchise. Neve Campbell, the original final girl, then returned, and the film itself returned to its original Scream roots, even bringing back, though possibly as an AI creation, Matthew Lillard as the original Ghostface killer, with an opening scene by a couple at the site of the first killings. In this case, returning to its roots, though, means returning to its exclusively Anglo makeup, at least in its leads, and eliminating the troubling Latin element. 2 points to make about this later iteration, which many critics say has jumped the shark, shorthand in Hollywood for exhausting its possibilities. First is the lack of comradeship and intimacy between its female characters. Sydney Campbell agrees to an interview by longtime reporter and open opportunist in the series, Gail Weathers. played by Courtney Cox. Only if Weathers will not, in her questioning, reproduce Sydney's trauma. Weathers betrays her trust in the interview and quickly goes there. This is bad enough, but in the end, Sydney claims that Weathers, who has constantly throughout the series betrayed her, is her only friend. If that's true, it's sad indeed, as the final girl stands alone with no female companions and misrecognizes her betrayer as her friend. Only in Hollywood, where this type of betrayal to get ahead, is commonplace, could this kind of non-relationship be offered as satisfying. A second crucial point to be made about this iteration and the franchise as a whole is that what Scream brought to the horror film is a high level of reflexivity. Characters throughout the 30-year life of the series cite religiously rules and situations of past horror films. As in Raimi's humor, this reflexivity allows the audience to shuffle off the horror as just another film, at the same time that the actual horror in the series increases. This is simply another way of desensitizing an audience to violence, the same kind of desensitization that occurs in American mainstream news media, so that Venezuela, Cuba, and now Iran 2026 recalls Iraq 2003, Afghanistan 2002, etc., in a horror series. Rather than being appalled, we are simply asked to see them as yet another franchise with its generic codes, or, to use the military slogan, rules of engagement. These horror films, in the light of what is going on, are not innocent. They are part of the process of desensitization that allows the American audience to sit comfortably experiencing violence and keeps the crowds of anti-war protesters out of the streets and instead in the safety of their plugged-in homes. The shock and awe of Baghdad, Gaza, Cuba, Venezuela, and now Tehran transmuted into manageable, ironized humor that we can live with and that does not disturb our shopping.
Lots of themes here. The economic kind of critique of Hollywood. It's like the celebration of like the ruthless success in Send and Help, Scream 7, largely, and tell me if you agree, the desensitizing violence.
I agree also that the word is hard to pronounce.
I'm like thinking about it. I'm like, desensitizing of violence. And then obviously like the last part you mentioned, like political conformity in Hollywood and the kind of the political pressures that you're under in Hollywood to either represent in general or just unrepresent overall. We can also look at, the claim of like Paramount Pictures and how it prioritizes like profits over creativity, but especially as like,
But by the way, I noticed that when I went to Scream 7, which I did this week, it says a Skydance company. That's Larry Ellison. That's David Ellison's company. So it's written right underneath and before you see Scream 7, it's a Skydance company, a Zionist entity.
Not Larry Ellison. And this is why they're tanking in the box office and streaming is growing, is because of these facts. Low budgets, like guaranteed or no guaranteed audiences, and then like these high profit margins that they try to maintain. But it represents like the common film industry of like modern day, with they want a strong delivery with we're creating this environment of like smaller investments. So I think that, overall that's hard. I want to talk about like the analysis kind of like Send Help. And I was taking notes on this when I was reading your part earlier, is it's kind of framed as this like feminist survival narrative that I think that these tropes are pretty successful in Hollywood and in the film industry. Linda, if I remember correctly, Linda is kind of like portrayed as, like this over subtle female, overlooked like female worker in patronage, and she's like oppressed by her male bosses.
Linda Little, that's her name, Little.
Exactly. And she's like forced to survive after this plane crash. And it's like this critique or this general representation of like workplace sexism. And I think that also sells. Sexism and sex sell in media in general. And so I think that that's pretty evident here. So, yeah.
I was surprised in watching it that I was sort of rooting for her. And I went to the movie because I thought, okay, this is going to be the story of a woman triumphing. But in order to triumph, she has to kill the black woman and the Asian guy. And that's part of her triumph. It's part of her triumph. And she also turns into someone who's violence-wise more vicious finally than her boss.
Right.
And then she gets the rewards from the society, the golf tournament, the celebrity.
Exactly. The tropes are like pretty evident here. I think they represent a lot of like modern day strife going on in our like societally, but I think it also sells, but I don't think people are reading it into, again, as deeply as, we analyze this, because again, it's a quiet nod to this kind of consent that it's okay, or that it can be like perpetuated throughout society. So
yeah, it's kind of open colonialism, really. That's sort of the movie's cheering on in the end,
Yeah, absolutely. And we just kind of go along with it. We're like, wow, I loved that scene. And it's like, we should probably look into that a little deeper.
Yeah. And the whole idea that, that Scream tried to do something different to revive it. That is, it wanted the larger audience of the two Latina actresses, Jenna Ortega and Marissa Barrera. But politics intervened, and Marissa Barrera became someone who, she still gets a lot of work, but she was not adequate to continue in the franchise, because of her statements about Gaza, and I think also because of her really active role in protesting police violence.
Also, if it's a Larry Ellison company.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, not yet. It's not a Larry Ellison company yet. Well, but it's this guy. Yes, it is. Paramount is. Yeah. Paramount is right now. Yeah.
Right. So that would never fly. So I'm imagining behind the scenes, there's definitely a lot of tension and
really possible.
Exactly. And I think actually with the Hunger Games, we went through this too. The newest, not the one that's coming out in November, but the one last year, I forget her name, but she, you know which one I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
The more recent one that came out like 2 years ago, maybe.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
I believe she came out with some comments about Gaza and stuff like that. And the PR was terrible.
Yeah.
Like absolutely terrible for her. And I'm willing to bet it was like Zionist media that was kind of cracking into her over it. So there's definitely a large punishment scale that you have to consider. So you either have to conform and capitulate and kind of represent this messaging and media that, this corporate media, but also Zionist television companies want, or you're kind of like relegated to the back and you become a nobody.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, Hollywood which supposedly is totally free, and the part of, America that still represents freedom, is pretty highly policed.
Yeah. And I think like, because it's entertainment, we kind of turn down the idea that it couldn't be political, but everything is political, and there's messaging in everything.
Yep. Yeah. Right. Well, that's it for this episode of Lies, More Lies, and Damn Media Lies. I'm Dennis Bro.
And I'm Jaleesa DuGros.
And we're Bro
and DuGros
going
at the news.
And we'll be back next time with more lies.